Okay.
Dear Professor Sharkey, dear students, dear colleagues, dear members and participants of this webinar, a very warm welcome to another most promising and interesting lecture within the context of our lecture series on ambivalent neighborhoods, religious, cultural, social, political dynamics between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So far, we have looked at very different contexts, philosophical perceptions, mutual perceptions, conceptual ideas about the concept of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, but mainly at urban centers and neighborhoods in different historical contexts. If you remember, last week we visited Isfahan in the 17th century, but we have already been in Sarajevo in the 18th, 19th century, in Salonika in the 20th century, and we're going to return to urban centers in future lectures to Modena in Italy in the 18th century, to Istanbul in the 17th century. But neighborhood does not only mean urban neighborhoods. There are so many different dimensions of what neighborhoods could mean. And I'm expecting, or I think that today we are going to look at different dimensions. And I'm delighted that we have been able to invite Professor Sharkey. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation and for speaking to us from Philadelphia, from your wonderful daylight garden behind you. And I would just say a few words about you and your research before we listen to your talk. Professor Sharkey is professor at the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Pennsylvania. She's an anthropologist, but also a historian of the modern Middle East. She studied at Yale, at Durham University. She taught at different places before coming to University of Pennsylvania, at Massachusetts, at Amherst, Massachusetts, but also MIT and Trinity College in Connecticut. And she has held visiting positions as well, especially in Paris at the École des Hautes Études. And her research is broad, but she focused on very interesting questions with regard to our topic, especially on conversion in the area that we are talking about. So I first came across some of her books when looking at literature on conversion. I'm just mentioning a few titles. First of all, but the first book was Living with Colonialism, Nationalism and Culture in the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan. That's 2003. And then the already mentioned topic on conversion, American Evangelicals in Egypt, Missionary Encounters in an Age of Empire. That was 2008. Then with a co-author, Mehmet Ali Dogan, she edited a volume, American Missionaries in the Middle East, Foundational Encounters. Also, she edited a volume on cultural conversions, unexpected consequences of Christian mission in the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia. So comparative volume. And I think that at least I expect that her lecture today will be based on insights that she gained in her book that was published in 2017 and devoted mainly to the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. That is before the end of the Ottoman Empire, and in a situation in which the Middle East was looking quite different than today in terms of the diversity of religions living together. And it's, if I'm not mistaken, an ethnological and cultural historical glance at this area by looking at questions of living together, context, social context, dress, music, and other things. And so I'm really looking forward to that. Your latest book is actually a volume, The Changing Terrain of Religious Freedom, which is another new topic that you're devoting yourself to. The title of the lecture tonight is How Religion Mattered, Lessons from the Middle Eastern History of Muslims, Christians, and Jews. We are very much looking forward to your lecture.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start by seeing if I can share my screen. Okay, I think it is here. And can you see that all right?
Yep.
Okay, I'm only going to use PowerPoint minimally, but I know sometimes it helps to have images occasionally on the screen when talking. So first, let me say it is an honor for me to be joining you from Philadelphia by Zoom. I wish we were in person, but I'm really happy for this chance to connect in this way. Today, as you may or may not know, is Martin Luther King Jr. Day, or MLK Day, as we call it for short. And it is a national holiday in the United States where civic engagement is a priority. So it feels very appropriate to be talking to you on this occasion because the work that you're doing together in this seminar is so rooted in a kind of civic consciousness. I understand that you're an interdisciplinary group, that you come from a variety of academic fields, religious studies, Jewish studies, history, philosophy, Islamic studies, and more, and that you're interested in the history and practice of interreligious relations. I hope that my presentation will address your varied interests, and I look forward to the discussion that will follow. In my talk today, I propose to tell you about some of the central questions and issues that prompted me to write my book called A History of Muslims, Christians, and Jews in the Middle East, and then to describe some of its major conclusions. So I aim to provide a meta-history that surveys some of the big questions that drove my book and some of the challenges that I faced while writing it, along with a history that presents parts of the overarching narrative of the book itself. The book, came out in 2017. And of course, since then, we have had these 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic. And that period, this strange time that we're in, has offered me opportunities for further reflection. So more than most talks that I've given in the past, but also perhaps because it is MLK Day, Martin Luther King Jr. Day, I propose to share some of these meta-historical reflections. And I would be interested to hear afterwards about how similar questions and issues may be arising in your own studies and how you are approaching them. So I'll just start by putting up this first slide, which will give you a sense of what I call the roadmap, to give you a sense of where I'm going. And the first, whoops, I misnumbered it as I was preparing it. Sorry about that, ignore the numbers there. But this gives you a sense of the order, and it's really when I get to this section down here, the Ottoman Middle East, managing religious diversity in an Islamic state, where I'll be talking about some of the content of the book, but the earlier sections of my presentation tonight are more about the reflection on the process. And what I'd also like to point out is that the images that I've used today on these slides all come from the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, or the Penn Museum. And this is a way of giving you a little sense of Philadelphia in the presentation, Philadelphia and its resources, and bringing my university to yours. So over the years, many of my students have remarked that the Middle East is a very religious place, perhaps the most religious in the world. They have seemed to regard religion as an ancient source of conflict in the region. When viewing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for example, they have often seemed to assume that age-old Jewish and Muslim hostilities have played a significant role in addition to any argument over territory. Listening to them over the years, I became convinced that they were giving religion too much credit for driving Middle Eastern conflicts, without appreciating the diversity and interconnectedness of Muslim, Christian, Jewish, and other people in the region's history. For better or for worse, they also seem to see religion as a divisive, not unifying cultural force. I decided to address students' interests by offering a seminar, a reading and discussion-centered course at the University of Pennsylvania on the history of Muslims, Christians, and Jews in the Middle East. In the process of teaching over a number of years, I learned a lot myself, And I also realized more acutely what I did not understand. In particular, I realized that many of the books by distinguished scholars, which I had been reading since I was an undergraduate, made religion seem both stronger and weaker as a social force in the modern era at the same time, without being clear about when and where religion was mattering more and mattering less. Ultimately, when an editor at Cambridge University Press asked me to write a book about the subject, what became a history of Muslims, Christians, and Jews in the Middle East, I decided to try to address the questions of my students, along with the lingering questions that I myself had. Among the questions I wanted to try to answer were these. What role has religion played in modern Middle Eastern history? How powerful has religious sentiment been relative to other social and cultural forces? How diverse were ordinary people's outlooks and experiences? How and when was religion in the Islamic Middle East more important in practice as opposed to theory, or vice versa? How did the heritage of early Islamic history inform the policies of successor states or not? And how did past legacies affect ordinary Muslim, Christian, Jewish, and other people as they crossed paths in everyday life? As I wrote the book, I decided also to try to address when religion was not important and when it was just one variable among others, such as age, gender, class, profession, and place of origin, in shaping how people looked at the world and moved within it. A big framing question became not how important was religion, but rather how was religion important? You can see this question reflected in the title of my talk today, How Religion Mattered, and in the subtitle, Lessons from the Middle Eastern History of Muslims, Christians, and Jews, which may have comparative relevance for other parts of the world today as well. I should also add that to make writing the book somewhat more manageable, because of course this could turn out to be an encyclopedia, I decided to focus mostly on the 100 or so years before the outbreak of World War I, a culturally vibrant era which set the stage for the Middle East as we know it today. And in the process, therefore, I decided also to restrict my attention to the Ottoman Empire, which meant that I did not end up covering Iran and Morocco, except with occasional references for comparative purposes. The editor at Cambridge commissioned the book for a series on the contemporary Middle East, a series that targets policy setters, well-educated members of the general public, and advanced undergraduate students. The challenge I realized of appealing to so many different potential readers led me to consider tackling even bigger questions, questions that experts in the field often seem to avoid addressing or took for granted, even though the answers are not self-evident. One of these questions is, what is religion? I had never thought to ask this question so directly before. And frankly, since publishing the book in 2017, I have been reflecting on it more and more. So knowing that you are, again, all coming from an interdisciplinary and comparative background, reflecting different cultural and religious traditions, I propose to start now by sharing some of my responses to this question about religion is, and then thinking about how we can apply it in our histories. The words religion or religious can, of course, cover many different things: devotional practices and rituals such as prayer and pilgrimage, belief systems, including attachments to doctrines or creeds, legal systems or frameworks that define kinship and regulate families through practices like marriage, and ethics, including forms of charity. We may also use religion in a psychological or existential sense to describe what people do to cope with fears about suffering, death, and what happens after death. We may connect religion to political ideologies too. For example, to ideas about how states or people should manage or regulate society. And we could connect it also to sectarianism, meaning us versus them sensibilities among subsets of larger religious communities that struggle for influence and resources. In modern Middle Eastern societies, for example, scholars point to sectarianism among Muslims to explain tensions between Sunni and Shi'i Muslims, or among Christians, for example, to explain rivalries between members of different institutional churches, such as Maronite Catholics and Greek Orthodox Christians. Scholars may also use religion to suggest the performance of religious identity and devotion, which we could describe in terms of public or private piety. In short, religion can cover a lot of ground, maybe too much ground. Recognizing the dizzying range of possibilities for religious expression, some scholars have begun to question religion's utility as an explanatory device, along with its history as a social concept. A book by Brent Nongri, which I mention here on this slide, an Australian scholar who studies early Christianity in the Mediterranean world, helped me to think through these ideas. Viewing the field as a scholar of ancient societies, Nongri argued that religion is a modern European concept which we should be cautious about projecting universally across history before modern times. The very idea of being religious, he wrote, requires a companion notion of what it would mean to be not religious. And this dichotomy was not part of the ancient world, where people did not distinguish religion as part of life, separate from things like politics, economics, and science. Nongri also questioned the tendency of scholars to call some things religious and other things secular, casting doubt on whether the act of distinguishing one from the other is straightforward or even makes sense. His arguments recall claims that scholars like Talal Asad, writing about Islam in Europe, and Hussein Ali Agrama and Saba Mahmoud, writing about post-colonial Egypt, have advanced regarding the impossibility of separating religion, not from the secular, but from secularism especially, meaning ideologies and discourses that rest on claims to religious neutrality in politics. They suggested that secular nationalism, whether in places like Egypt and Turkey, or even as laïcité in France, whether that was or has been misleading or at worst illusory as a political platform, based more on claims to neutrality than on the true absence of religious or sectarian bias in shaping public affairs and popular attitudes. I share their skepticism, along with the confusion about dividing the religious from the secular. And so I tried in my book to avoid drawing or assuming or suggesting religious secular distinctions, because I have become more convinced that discerning religion, or the lack of it, is as formidable an intellectual puzzle for the modern period as it may be for ancient times. As a historian educated in the field as an undergraduate of anthropology, because I did my undergraduate degree at Yale in anthropology and my PhD in history at Princeton, I value the history of the mundane and the history of everyday life, a field that German scholars have done a lot to advance. And this idea of the history of everyday life acknowledges the importance of routine, even banal living in history. How did people live in the past? What did they do and what did they think? How did they move and behave? How did they interpret their worlds? These questions about the nature and meaning of everyday life have propelled my fascination with history since I was a child, and probably explain why my book cites evidence for change and contact, not only through things like battles and edicts, but also through humble objects like forks and shoes, or as you see here, spoons and cups. In the book, I also study the history of clothing quite closely, while arguing that clothing reflected social and political moods and the state of Muslim, Christian, and Jewish relations in different periods. More broadly, my belief in the importance of everyday life also influenced my decision to write about Muslims, Christians, and Jews, the social and cultural history of people, and not about Islam, Christianity, and Judaism as abstract religious systems with theological and cosmological foundations. My focus on the mundane experience of religion and on other aspects of social and cultural life resonates also with the work of the sociologist of religion, Meredith McGuire, who took the diversity of religious practice as her starting point in a study that she wrote about American Catholics in the early 20th century, or early 21st century. In practice, she pointed out, people do not obsessively follow doctrines and normative practices set from on high. Rather, they experience religion in their own ways, applying and adapting practices and ideas as they go along in order to suit their needs, preferences, and circumstances. Understanding lived religion means examining what ordinary people have actually done and thought, not what religious institutions and authorities have in theory prescribed. So what people really do, as opposed to what they're supposed to do, sometimes you could say. I like McGuire's approach to thinking of religion, as she wrote, at the individual level as an, quote, ever-changing, multifaceted, often messy, even contradictory amalgam of beliefs and practices, end quote. In approaching Middle Eastern history, I tried in the book to approach religion as something that is messy, lived, and individual too. But I had philosophical and not only empirical reasons for taking this approach. Acknowledging variety in practice and outlook, I maintain, enables us to recognize human agency in history, and thus human responsibility for actions as well. At the same time, it enables us to avoid the trap of treating people as if they belong to unchanging social monoliths. If we fail to acknowledge diversity, we run the risk of allowing our histories to degenerate into finger-pointing exercises, or as we might say in English, blame games, that assign responsibility for past crises, massacres, and other bad things to Muslim, Christian, and Jewish collectives. Such exercises may also add up to a retrospective xenophobia that can have consequences for current events. Finally, in writing the book, I drew inspiration from the ideas of the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur, who described the act of writing history as an effort of, quote, remembering an image of the past, also searching for it and then doing something, end quote. Writing history, as he described it, entails a process of active engagement. According to Ricoeur, doing something constructive with or for history does not mean passing judgment on it, as when determining victims and guilty parties. Rather, he seemed to suggest it means seeking to understand as a way of moving forward alone or together with others. This ideal of seeking to understand history for the sake of a better world, for making a better world now, inspired me as I was writing. Regardless of how we define religion or how we decide to approach it, the bottom line is that religion, like any other factor shaping behavior and identity, has limits in what it explains. Many other factors such as education, relative wealth or poverty, gender and age have shaped people and societies, individuals and individual behaviors and social movements. Of course, once we recognize the input of multiple variables, we face the challenge of assessing when people acted in their religious roles on a particular occasion, as opposed to in their other capacities, when they were, say, Christians, as opposed to, say, Armenians or merchants. And more than that, how much of people's actions derive from impulses, assumptions, or behaviors that we could call, again, religious in nature. We return, in short, to the question not only of how religion mattered, but how much it mattered proportionally, and when it was or was not a factor of relevance. I had to confront this question about the how muchness of religion anew when I finally submitted my manuscript to Cambridge University Press. To get a final assessment before publication, the editor sent the text at this final stage to 2 anonymous readers for what they call exit reviews. One of the anonymous readers wrote back suggesting that I did not go far enough in recognizing plural identities and that I gave too much weight to religion in assessing social dynamics. This referee expressed particular dissatisfaction with the way that I frequently referred to groups of people as Muslims, Christians, and Jews. Merely by adopting these terms as the organizational principle for my book, this person seemed to suggest, I reified Muslims, Christians, and Jews as groups, asserted borders between social collectives, and rendered less visible other kinds of identity that people shared. In a comment that really surprised me, the referee added, and here I quote from this anonymous report, "To speak of Jews, Christians, and Muslims before the 20th century is an anachronism." Before the 20th century, this person maintained, quote, "Most of the followers of these faiths lived far away from any institutional religion and interacted in a rural religion that was largely a syncretic amalgamation of local traditions and superstitions," end quote. In my view, the referee took the idea of variable lived religion to a radical extreme while advancing a paradoxical claim. The paradox occurred when this person questioned the legitimacy of treating most people as Muslims, Christians, and Jews, and yet described them as followers of these faiths, meaning followers of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, implying that they were indeed Muslims, Christians, and Jews. The referee did not supply or specify a better alternative for differentiating people while taking account of religion and other factors, but left the impression of favoring place-based, maybe we could say secular identifiers instead, calling people, for example, Syrians or residents of Cairo, instead of thinking of them as Muslims, Christians, or Jews. The referee also left the impression of urban and rural societies that were so different that they deserved separate analysis. Along the way, the referee implicitly posed 3 questions which forced me to think more deeply about what I wanted to argue and convey. I pose these questions and insert my responses I propose to do that for you now to give you a sense of how I came to think about what the referee was asking. And I think, as you'll see, it helped me, and I'm grateful to the person for writing this because it helped me to strengthen my arguments. And I think you might find them interesting as well. So first, the referee asked, why speak of people as Muslims, Christians, or Jews at all if their lived religions were pluralistic in the extreme? My answer is that we can call people Muslims, Christians, and Jews, in part, because Islamic states called them that and treated them accordingly in laws and policies. From the early Islamic era, Islamic states expected people to have a religion, generally Islam, Christianity, or Judaism, or in Iran, in practice, Zoroastrianism. And these were religions whose adherents recognized God and had scriptures. Religion functioned as a building block of society and bore upon matters such as law, taxation, and military recruitment. It contributed to social hierarchies and shaped attitudes and expectations across the centuries in lands where Islamic rule prevailed. Religion functioned as a category akin to sex, based on the assumption that people were either male or female, or another assumed binary, whether a person was slave or free, which historically informed laws, policies, and attitudes in similar ways. Second, the referee asked, if diversity is a premise, then why attribute social actions rooted in religious identities to collective Muslims, Christians, and Jews? In fact, I strove in the book to avoid, again, presenting people as monoliths, and to approach the study of individual groups with nuance, to avoid imparting the sense that individuals or collectives acted according to scripts that religion, here meaning Islam, Christianity, and Judaism in the abstract, prescribed. The referee's comments confirmed for me the importance of emphasizing this point throughout the book. And third, the referee questioned my discussion of occasional egregious episodes of violence that erupted among Muslims, Christians, and Jews. Was drawing attention to these episodes appropriate, the referee asked, considering that most people in most times seem to get along reasonably well? In asking this question, the referee pointed to my description of events like the Damascus affair, which scholars sometimes cite as an example of how modern Europe exported Christian anti-Semitism to the Islamic Middle East. This episode occurred in 1840 when Christians in Damascus accused Jews of killing an Italian priest and making bread from his blood and bones, whereupon Muslim authorities, who at that time represented the government of Egypt, tortured Jews with the encouragement of French diplomats in order to force confessions. In fact, my book does not include many episodes like this one. Most of it covers material that was far more mundane. The referee nevertheless pressed me to justify why I should cover such a horrific incident at all, since it would leave a much stronger impression on readers than periods of apparent uneventfulness. Once again, the process of writing the book forced me to confront many questions. Why dig up history if it unearths information that can lead to bad feelings and mistrust? This, I believe, is what the referee was asking, a question that unleashes a cascade of further questions in turn. Is it appropriate for historians to make conflicts in history recede by not mentioning them? In essence, to help along a process of forgetting. Is forgetting an ethical option? And what should we choose to remember? To make a happy and peaceful future, should we focus on moments of past harmony and try to forget bad things that happened? How much should we try to forget? Paul Ricoeur suggested that the historian should not pass judgment. Does this mean that the historian should always aim for reconciliation at the cost of suppressing the worst? Where should historians as public intellectuals draw the line between constructive engagement and polemic or propaganda? How far should we go in our quest for coexistence now and with an eye to the past and looking ahead to the future? Confronting these questions made my book stronger and forced me to take a stand on some issues, a clearer stand. I realized for a start that I wanted to acknowledge crises while still recognizing the history of the mostly calm and the quite possibly boring, the history of what the referee called apparent uneventfulness. The history of unsensational interactions among Muslims and non-Muslims, again, we could maybe call it boring history, is worth telling for current readers, certainly like many of my American students, who, influenced by media portrayals and by popular attitudes towards Middle Eastern conflicts and their US entanglements, have often assumed that the Middle East is a den of religious hostility. For such readers, telling the history of people as they lived for generations side by side, often in the same neighborhoods and apartment buildings, in conditions that were, if not great, then mostly okay, is worth doing. At the same time, failing to recall egregious incidents of violence and conflict when they happened may amount to lies and deceptions which can undermine the credibility and purpose of the whole enterprise. The challenge surely rests in seeking a balance, And we must recognize religion along the way as an important part of people's lives, of lives that blended the banal with the occasionally turbulent, while seeing the good and the bad without sugarcoating the past to make it easier to swallow. Since my goal for this book was to write, again, one relatively short volume and not an encyclopedia, as I mentioned before, I had to cut things down. So I decided again to stop with World War I and to focus on the Ottoman Empire so that I could study the Ottoman Empire as a kind of political laboratory, a single political laboratory. In addition to setting geographic and temporal parameters, and here now I'm going to start to tell you about some of the specific Middle East-centered content of the book, I knew I would need to provide enough background so that educated non-specialist readers could follow the narrative. Offering a rapid overview of early Islamic State policies towards Muslims and non-Muslims seemed critical, since the Ottoman Empire adapted some precedents of early Islamic practice and law by taking people's religious status into account for matters ranging from military recruitment and taxation to intermarriage and inheritance. In this way, Ottoman rulers across the centuries fashioned policies for managing religious diversity, while assuming that its subjects were clearly identifiable and categorizable as Muslims, Christians, and Jews. A challenge I faced, though, was in providing this historical background without giving readers the impression that conditions were unchanging across the centuries and that traditions were fixed and solid. The background that I ultimately provided, which I propose to summarize briefly now, went roughly like this. Islamic states and societies grew steadily over the course of centuries, absorbing cultural influences and responding to local conditions. They were never-ending works in progress, as all other states and societies in world history have been. What Muslim rulers said, thought, and did in, say, late 7th century Damascus was not what their Ottoman successors were doing in 19th century Salonika, now Thessaloniki in Greece, or Mosul, now in Iraq. And yet Muslims over many centuries and generations looked to the early Islamic world for ideas about how to maintain a Muslim-led social and political order while accommodating religious diversity among Christians and Jews who shared their belief in God, confirming a principle of accommodation that the Quran also set out. Ottoman rulers they tried to follow early Islamic precedents, and they did so for pragmatic political reasons too. Islamic probity, or the impression of it, provided a credential for the Ottoman Empire, provided grounds for legitimacy that stressed connections to earlier Islamic empires. Ottoman rulers did have political reasons, in other words, for convincing their subjects that they were respecting and maintaining traditions. Various ideas set the ground rules for intercommunal relations between Muslims, who represented the politically dominant group, and non-Muslims, Christians and Jews, in Ottoman lands. And among these principles were the ideas that Christians and Jews should be able to flourish in Islamic domains, even if Muslims were dominant in law and society, that people could join Islam from Christianity and Judaism through conversion, but that they could not leave Islam for another religion, so that Muslims could not become Jews, for example, or could not become Christians, and that Muslim men could marry Jewish and Christian women, even though Christian and Jewish men could not do the same with Muslim females. Essential too was the idea that children born to Muslim fathers were Muslim, and that mothers who might be Christian or Jewish did not transmit their religious status to their offspring, who according to Islamic law, would be following the father's religion of Islam. These policies did allow Christian and Jewish communities to persist over the centuries, but they also contributed in the long run to the steady attrition of and reduction of Christian and Jewish populations, while enabling Muslims to go from being a dominant minority in the first century of Islam to a dominant majority a few centuries later. The Ottoman Empire quite strikingly experienced a similar demographic shift, especially after the conquest of Constantinople in 1453. One of the most significant phenomena of early Islamic history, and one of the most far-reaching in its legacies for non-Muslims, was a set of variable texts of uncertain dates that people later remembered as the Pact of Omar. Even today, this supposed text informs legal and social practice in many Middle Eastern countries, such as Egypt. The Pact of Omar was theoretically an agreement that the early Muslims reached with the Christians of Syria at the time of the Islamic conquests in the early 7th century, specifying how Christians should behave relative to Muslims. In practice, it applied to Jews as well. The pact declared that the non-Muslims could live peacefully in Islamic domains if they recognized their subordination to Muslims in certain ways as Ahla Dhimma or Dhimmis, meaning people of the pact. As a sign of their subordination, Christians and Jews as Dhimmis had to pay a special tax called the jizya to the Muslim rulers. At the same time as non-Muslims, they could not carry weapons, ride horses, build new places of worship or fix old ones, ring church bells or make too much noise, dress like Muslims, and more. Some of these rules persisted or influenced policy more than others as generations went on and as Islamic territories grew. One rule that endured widely and that applied to practices in the Ottoman Empire as well was the pact's ban on non-Muslims bearing weapons. And until the 20th century opened, non-Muslims therefore did not serve as combatants in Islamic State armies. As for the ban on building or repairing places of worship or building, so churches and synagogues, Christians and Jews occasionally, of course, did get permission to fix places of worship or to build new structures, but securing approval sometimes became difficult and arguably became more difficult as the size of and the proportion of the Muslim majority grew, while in Egypt, the restrictions notoriously linger even today. By applying the extra tax called the jizya on non-Muslims, a tax that the Ottoman Empire applied throughout most of its history, the Pact of Omar gave incentives for conversion to Islam as well. For some Christian men, restrictions on access to the military, an institution that in many lands during the pre-modern era provided lucrative opportunities for extracting booty and other benefits, also incentivized conversion. Reflecting on the long-running attrition or reduction of non-Muslim communities through conversion to Islam, the historian Bernard Lewis made the intriguing claim that Christians may have had a harder time than Jews living with the restrictions from the Pact of Omar, some of which they found humiliating. Lewis suggested that Christians historically had been more accustomed than Jews to dominate, and thus became more likely to convert to Islam to join the dominant group. It is certainly true that by the modern era, indigenous Jewish communities persisted across North Africa into Morocco, whereas Christian communities west of Egypt had vanished. The idea that Christians and Jews were dhimmis persisted throughout most of the Ottoman era and only ended officially in the mid-19th century when the empire issued reforms that abandoned the practice of classifying non-Muslims in this way. Yet even when the official practice of identifying non-Muslims as dhimmis officially ended, popular attitudes about non-Muslims as dhimmis persisted long afterwards. And by the way, dhimmi discourses surface even today, especially among Islamist groups, some of whose members have maintained that non-Muslims should remain subordinate, and more than that, should remain keenly aware of their subordination vis-a-vis Muslims. During the Syrian civil war, in 2014, for example, the Islamic State invoked these old ideas by ordering Christians in the town of Raqqa to pay them a tax in gold on the grounds that the Christians were dhimmis who had to submit the jizya to Muslims for the right of persistence and protection. No historical survey of intercommunal relations in the Ottoman Empire would be complete without noting the so-called Ottoman millet system, even if historians now admit that it was never as systematic and as coherent as some of them used to think. Before the 19th century, the Ottoman arrangement with non-Muslims worked roughly as follows. Authorities granted Jews and Christians considerable autonomy over their internal affairs, allowing them to manage family practices like marriage, as well as things like communal charity, education and welfare, and handling disputes. And in this sense, Ottoman practice closely followed practices of the early Islamic era. But Ottoman practices were distinctive in two ways. First, Ottoman authorities, and especially increasingly with time, designated representatives of communities to liaise with them for the sake of maintaining public order. These representatives functioned as intermediaries towards their communities and could thereby exercise influence among them. And second, another distinctive feature, arguably, in the Ottoman context, was that knowing that Christians and Jews were internally diverse and that Christian groups had a pronounced tendency towards fractiousness and mutual hostility, Ottoman authorities connected with Armenian and Greek Christians separately, and increasingly over time with other Christian groups separately too. In other words, they stood ready to identify their Christian subjects not just as one Christian group, but as multiple Christian communities. We could argue that the Ottoman state enshrined sectarianism, here meaning sect-based recognition, with consequences for sectarian consciousness among substantial Christian communities that by the late 1870s still accounted for 25 to 30% of the Ottoman subject population. I mean, another way of putting it is we could say on the one hand, the Ottomans recognized Christian autonomy among Christian groups. We could also say that they used it as a tactic of divide and rule, as empire builders do. In any case, this formal recognition of Christian plurality, again, the idea that there were multiple Christian and Jewish groups and not just one, set Ottoman governance in theory apart from the earlier Islamic states and explains why scholars have persisted in pointing to a distinctive Ottoman system. Now, the 19th century brought many dramatic changes to the social and political landscape of the Ottoman Empire. The empire began to lose territory through wars and annexations to rival imperial powers, and the loss of Greece in the 1820s was especially troubling in this regard. At the same time, ideas from revolutionary France based on Enlightenment conceptions of liberty, social parity, and citizenship began to influence Ottoman Muslim and non-Muslim thinkers. Christian missionaries, initially Catholics and later also Protestants, entered the region from Europe and North America and attracted local Christians to schools, churches, and eventually medical clinics, while establishing or expanding breakaway churches. Muslims and Jews began to attend Christian schools as well. Later in the century, French Jewish activists also began to appeal to the empire's Jews in towns and cities like Cairo and Salonika. Ottoman thinkers responded to these developments in the mid-19th century by issuing a series of reforms known as the Tanzimat, or reorganizations. The Tanzimat aimed to strengthen the empire in practical ways through bureaucratic and infrastructural projects, but also by building collective morale to ensure the loyalty of non-Muslims while averting criticism from Christian powers of Europe that stood ready to intervene. In this period, Ottoman reformers advocated abandoning the language of Muslim privilege over non-Muslims as dhimmis, while promoting ideas about commonality and even parity. In major reform decrees of 1839 and 1856, the Ottoman Sultan even seemed to declare a policy of religious equality. I spent many pages in the book reflecting on the ambiguities and consequences of these reforms, whether the Sultan was really sincere in his claims or whether he just wanted to win favor with European diplomats, and whether the reforms improved the situation of non-Muslims and built an idea of collective Ottoman citizenship and incipient nationhood, or whether it did just the opposite by provoking resentments among formerly and unquestionably dominant Muslims while leading to the deterioration of Muslim, Christian, and Muslim-Jewish relations. We could even ask how much the reforms changed at all, considering that after the Ottoman state stopped requiring Christians and Jews to pay the jizya tax as dhimmis, it began to demand a new tax from non-Muslims in the same amount instead. The evidence is messy and complicated and points in many directions. Those scholars who believe that intercommunal relations got worse in the 19th century in spite of or because of these various reforms cite events like massacres against Armenian Christians in Anatolia, which occurred first in the 1890s and which predated the events starting in 1915 that many Armenians today regard as genocide. These scholars point to segments of Muslim populations of ethnic Turks, Kurds, and others who resented the way Armenians were advancing in wealth, health, and education, partly as a result of their access to foreign mission schools and clinics. We could give a class-based explanation rather than a religious or ethnic-based explanation if we chose to do so, but the fact is that religion, class, and ethnicity overlapped in complicated ways. Other scholars believe that relations between Muslim and Christian groups got worse, but they blame it on the forces of European imperialism, especially British, French, and Russian imperialism, along with incipient American imperialism, while arguing that foreigners like missionaries and consuls sharpened local and regional cultures of sectarianism by favoring certain groups over others and forging partisan alliances. Still others believe that relations improved and were good, with some of those who see improvement attributing the change to secularism and the retraction of religion from the public sphere. Some scholars who take this benign and optimistic view seem to regard the advance of what they call secularism and the disappearance of religion as a good thing, insofar as they implicitly see religion as a negative force. In my book, I tried to show that relations changed in response to both internal and external pressures, and that circumstances varied considerably from one place to another. Reflecting on the span of Ottoman history during the 19th century, intercommunal relations improved and worsened. It depended on who you were and where you lived. The situation may have worsened for Armenian Christians in what is now Eastern Turkey around 1895, for example. But in the same period, Muslims, Christians, and Jews in Egypt, in places like Cairo, were getting along so well that one of the leading ecclesiastical historians of the Coptic Orthodox community later reflected on the immediate pre-World War I period as a golden age of Muslim-Christian relations in the Nile Valley. Obviously, experiences also varied among individuals who ostensibly belonged to the same group. The bottom line is that history is messy, just as social relations are messy. We should expect to find no easy answers, and our narratives should be careful to account for complexity. Writing a history, and now I'm going to move towards my conclusion. Writing the history of religious communities and how groups and individuals related to each other can be sensitive because so many people care deeply about the subject. The subject matters to a lot of people. This sensitivity raises a whole slew of philosophical and practical questions, some of which I raised at the start of my talk. What responsibility do historians face in selecting what to remember and what to tell? How can we acknowledge legacies from the past without denying change, misrepresenting tradition, or descending into anachronism and stereotyping and xenophobia? How can we discuss people as members of groups while acknowledging diversity and individual agency and responsibility in history? And returning to the question of balance in understanding religion, how can we recognize the role of religion in shaping people's identities and everyday lives without exaggerating its importance relative to other components of culture? How can we know how and how much religion mattered? We may never find answers that fully satisfy us. Our quest for understanding will continue. That said, I do feel relatively confident in asserting that it does make sense to refer to people as Muslims, Christians, and Jews in this history, regardless of individual distinctions and variations in practice and belief among people. That's because Islamic states, like the Ottoman state, required its subjects to have a religion, regardless of individual distinctions and regardless of variations in practice and belief among people. And their insistence on classifying people according, in this way, played a critical role in shaping how people would have understood or needed to understand their places in the world and their relationships to others. It affected life in very practical ways. The state expected people to have religion, to identify as Muslim, Christian, or Jewish, and applied laws accordingly, with consequences for real life things like whom one could marry, how much and what kind of tax one had to pay, whether or not a person could serve in the military, and more. This legacy of Ottoman history and of earlier Islamic history in general has persisted until today. Post-Ottoman Middle Eastern states, including Muslim majority states like Turkey and Egypt, but also Israel as a Jewish majority state, which is also a post-Ottoman state, continue to expect people to have a religion, which then determines in some cases which laws and policies apply to them, with consequences for things like who and how they can marry again, and even what textbooks they might use or what they might study in schools. More than anything else, it may be this historic practice of institutionalizing religion, which has made Middle Eastern states and societies seem so religious to people who live in other parts of the world, where religious identity has increasingly become open to self-selection, mutation, and even rejection. Regardless, we need to continue questioning how and how much state uses of religion as a legal, fiscal, and social category shaped or still shapes individual and collective behaviors and expectations among people in the course of everyday lives. Meanwhile, if we want to find positive material from history as lessons that can help us to build better societies now, I suggest that we look to the largely unsensational history of everyday life. This is the history of ordinary people who lived in proximity, not just as ambivalent neighbors, to borrow the title of this talk series that you have organized, but as actively engaged neighbors who knew that they were stuck in this world together as they tried to get by. I have one last point that I would like to make here. People all over the world seem to look back on their school days and think of history as a really boring subject. I mean, you'll often hear people say, oh, history is so boring. History in school was so boring. I have always found history exciting. That's why I'm a historian. But I am beginning to think in another way that boring history, or the history of the boring and the unsensational, is underrated. Maybe this feeling is coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic experience. The history of quiet events, of living together peaceably day by day, when no news is good news, as we might say in English, when not so much seems to be happening, maybe all of that is good. We tend to hear most about history when bad things happen. But we should do more to remember times and places that have been pretty good or mostly okay. Like I would argue, most of the history of Muslim, Christian, and Jewish people as they related to each other in the Middle East across generations. I think it may be too pessimistic to think about people being ambivalent neighbors, stuck together, but not so happily. And it would be better for us to think about people just being neighbors, coping with challenges and moving along side by side while facing matters of common concern. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for a fascinating, totally unboring lecture on potentially boring history. Thank you so very much also for the meta-historical reflections, especially at the beginning, but also in your conclusion about the ambiguities and the complexities. I would love to discuss with you the question of ambivalence later on, but I'm first of all looking at the chat, our audience. To the audience, I would like to say that same procedure as last week and the weeks before. You can either raise the yellow hand or indicate in the chat that you would like to pose a question, or just write a question in the chat, or just speak. So please use all the potential means of commenting and asking questions and responding to this wonderful lecture. And as always, let me just start.
By the way, I'll just say, with this Zoom webinar format, it's very strange. I don't get to see everybody's faces. So it's easier when we can all see one another, but maybe someday soon we'll all be back in person, and then that kind of dynamic will, be smoother. But for now, any questions or thoughts that you have, I'd appreciate hearing, and also about applying it to the series that you're leading. I would be interested in your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah. I mean, just let me, I adopted this this title from David Nirenberg's book, of course. And what convinced me, of course, was mainly for the Middle Ages, this idea of the co-constitution of the different traditions. It's very much phrased from the context of the co-production of thought and knowledge and these kind of things. Whereas what you're bringing into the discussion from your approach everyday life history is, of course, a wonderful nuance to the title and the concept that we're using here. And I'm really glad that this dimension becomes so prominent in your talk. But I was wondering how you would respond to David Nirenberg's concept, which he also explained in the series at the beginning in October.
Well, it's this balancing act. I mean, he's of course responding to the idea, the conviviality thesis of presenting the tendency to present a kind of golden ageist, viewing the world, everything was great, the what some might call the kumbaya version of history, and to recognize the tension. So I appreciate that. I appreciate the emphasis on ambivalence, and I can see why that's necessary as a corrective in history. I think I'm thinking more, though, of this history in your context, and thinking about, I suspect also because, again, it is Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and I'm thinking about how we have to constructively, positively, and optimistically try to work together. So I guess I'm just trying to shift the pendulum a little bit more towards something potentially optimistic, especially if we want to be able to use these past histories in managing the challenges of our own diverse societies today.
Yes. I mean, we discussed something similar last week when discussing Isfahan in the 17th century, because what we were presented was also an image of a ruler, Shah Abbas, who was actually a master in managing diversity, but we were also pointed towards the power politics and the power relations behind that policy. And I was wondering, I mean, do we have sources, Jewish, Christian sources who are actually reflecting on the experience of the politics that they were exposed to? I mean, is it a matter of changing the perspective? If you look from a Jewish perspective or a Christian perspective to Ottoman policy, is that different than looking at the historian today to that history?
Well, that's a really big question and a difficult one. And you're reminding me of an article that I wrote, and it just appeared in a book about Coptic history in Egypt. And I referred to what I call the Rashomon effect in Coptic history, referring to the Japanese movie called Rashomon, where people, it's a famous movie in Japan that reflects on a death that occurred and how different people remember it and the conflicting accounts. And basically in this article, I argued, depending upon the source that we look at, the period in which they're writing, the reflections on the same history change, and often change dramatically. I think a lot of times, then there's also the challenge of people, and I think this also goes to your question, when we're living in a moment, we're not looking at it the same way as when we're looking back 100 years later. So people living in 1875 in Cairo, reflecting on the Ottoman decree, the Ottoman edict of 1856, they were understanding and remembering it differently. But were they thinking about it in terms of what the consequences would be for how Christians and Jews were living as dhimmis? No, that wasn't a question they were asking. Instead, I mean, some of the people that I was studying were asking questions like, can we build a new church? Do we really have to get this permission? Can this Muslim man convert to Christianity if he wants to? Will this new policy of a declaration of religious equality allow movements between religious groups in new ways? They were trying to figure out what was going on, and it wasn't clear at the time. So we need to find all of those contemporary sources, what historians call primary sources, right? But of course, the questions that we ask about those sources, the patterns that we see change as we move forward in time. That's why I think also, and this is one of the challenges we face, history is always a moving target. The past changes as we look back on it, which is to say that what seems important or relevant changes. And what seems important or relevant often rises from our present day needs. Why do we study history? It's because, as some other theorists of history have said, we seek usable pasts. Oh, I see a question.
Okay, right. Yeah, Helen Pschibela, please.
Yeah, hello. Thank you very much for your very, very interesting talk. And first of all, I want to say I studied history as well and would never think that history is something boring, not at all. And I'm also interested in kind of dress history. So it was interesting that you said you would, you said something like, if I recall it rightly, that clothing reflected social and cultural moods. And I do have a specific question. Do you know by any chance the Hashomer group in early 20th century Palestine? It was a Jewish self-defense group whose members came mainly from Tsarist Russia. And there are very famous pictures of them by Avram Soskin. And he was kind of the house and home photographer of this group, and they present themselves in Bedouin clothes and on horseback and with weapons. And my question now is, of course, you said that after the reforms, there were no sartorial laws anymore for Jews and Christians and Muslims. And what I'm interested in is that I would like to hear what you think about it. That I would say that most of these groups would define themselves mostly as secular, and there were immigrants from Russia, so not from a Muslim country. So they were not in their families. There was not this tradition of sartorial laws within a Muslim country, and of course for them dressing as Bedouins was kind of presenting themselves as some as potent, and this whole riding on horseback and showing weapons and so on. And in contrast, do you think that Jews? I wouldn't know. I think there were not very many Zionist Jews who were born in Palestine and grew up there. But would you think that they kind of wouldn't do the same thing because of the sartorial laws that were in the that existed in the Ottoman Empire? I hope I made myself clear in a way. It was a kind of very complicated question, but I hope you know what I'm getting at. Yeah.
You ask fascinating questions. I wish we had the opportunity to talk more, because I can tell we'd have a lot to talk about. I have a few thoughts in regard to what you're asking. So I think one of the questions you're asking is, to what extent were Jews, like the ones you're mentioning, but we could apply this as well to Christians, to what extent were they beginning to resist or resist old conventions and assert places in society, for example, by dressing as Bedouins or posing in photographs with weapons? And of course, there's a large literature on the culture of performative dress, especially in the 19th century, the orientalizing and self-orientalizing of some groups, and the idea that the Bedouin in particular represented an ideal of masculinity or virility that the local tourists, as well as perhaps Zionist settlers, may have wanted to emulate. There's a literature on that. But the question is, I think you're also asking, to what extent were these changes conscious? There's a wonderful book that I really love by somebody named Yedida Kalfon-Stillman called Arab Dress. And in it, in the final chapter, she suggests that Jews and Christians in the 19th and early 20th century ended up emulating, in particular, European dress. They started dressing more and more like Europeans, not because they wanted to assert themselves, they did, but they also wanted to blend in. And that by dressing like Europeans, rather than symbolizing their support for European ways, it enabled them to not stand out. So there was a desire, on the one hand, to not draw attention to themselves, to blend in, to seem equal with Muslims. You're suggesting a group that was trying to look more like local Muslims as a way of suggesting virility and masculinity and indigenization and association with the landscape. But another thing is the extent to which Christians and Jews were starting to assert a use of weapons. And I'd like to share to add on to what you said, one fascinating example that I came across from an art historian who studies Coptic Orthodox Christian icons in churches from the 18th century. He argued that, and he showed with a variety of evidence, that from the 18th century, Christians in churches started to paint scenes of saints on horseback carrying weapons that on the one hand seemed to evoke earlier Byzantine era patterns of iconography, but also he suggests we're trying to resist this ban on weaponry by incorporating it in these paintings of saints in churches. Even the Virgin Mary, they started to portray on churches, I think, on horseback. I think we can start to see in some of these choices, like the one you're describing in the photographs from the early 20th century, different forms of cultural assertion. So performance, assertion, blending in, a lot of things like that are going on. Certainly, though, there is this, Orientalist fascination with the Bedouin and the ideal of masculinity that would have been factoring into the choices that you're describing as well. And then too, these people were getting photographed. I mean, that's another way they were performing, right? They're actually dressing up, and then people are taking photographs. So there's that element of the staging of identities too.
There's a question in the chat. I don't know whether you can see it. Otherwise, I can just read it. It's by Rosa Reicher.
Memory culture, good and bad memory. Memory culture is an ethical question. Is this helpful to solve religious conflicts? How do you define memory culture? Well, this is well, first of all, I would say, I don't think we can describe it as a singular noun. I don't think we can describe memory culture in the singular. It makes more sense to think of memory cultures, but also culture suggests that there's a body, a passed down body of memories, right? A culture suggests some sort of formation as opposed to individual attempts to cope with and narrate this. So good and bad memory, I don't know. And is it helpful to solve religious conflicts? Then we come back to the issue again about what is a religious conflict? When is the conflict even religious? And when is it actually really about something else? So in all of the major examples of conflicts that ostensibly seem like religious conflicts in Middle Eastern history, we can find other factors. In the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, territorial dimensions. In the Armenian tensions with Turks and Kurds and Circassians and others in the late 19th, early 20th century, resentments over access to wealth and well-being and opportunities. So I think the best way to do it is not to think about good and bad memory according to religions, but maybe this, good and bad memory according to cultural groups and formations. I'm not sure, but I think I don't even feel comfortable with the idea of religious conflict as an explanatory device.
Okay. Are there any further questions or comments? Otherwise, I will just continue with the question that I was thinking about while listening to you. And that is, you have these really convincing general remarks about everyday history as a great way to look at religious distinctive communities, how they're living together, and how this changes the perception in contrast to when you look at teachings and dogmas and how people discuss beliefs and convictions. I was wondering, to what extent is this period and also this geographical era of the Middle East something distinctive which supports your idea, or whether you can actually apply this approach to other contexts as well? Let's say we would look at Western European history, that period, and the way religion was discussed there, let's say between Protestant majorities and Jewish minorities. So is that, would that be different, or to put it differently, I mean, is the fact that you're talking especially about the Muslim Ottoman tradition of dealing with diversity makes it a unique example that makes this approach about everyday history especially fitting?
So let me see if I can address. So you're asking to what extent are these ideas of comparative relevance, and to what extent may they be specific? I think they're very much of comparative relevance, and I'll give you some examples, not from Europe, but from the United States. This most recent book that I published is a volume of essays called The Changing Terrain of Religious Freedom, which came out of a conference series at the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy at the University of Pennsylvania. And we had case studies about the United States and other countries such as India and Canada and elsewhere. There was one from Germany. And my co-editor and I, we ended up writing an introductory essay, and I found myself studying aspects of US history more closely. And I'll give you just one example from the history of Philadelphia. In the 1870s, there were a series of riots in Philadelphia, actually very close to where you would have been living, by the way, when you were at the Cat Center, right in that neighborhood, where Protestants massacred Catholics and attacked a local Catholic church. So on the one hand, we could describe this as a Protestant Catholic sectarian tension in the region, in the city's history, but in one neighborhood. But I realized upon closer study that the rioters attacked an Irish church, an Irish Catholic church, and did not attack a German Catholic church, which was in the same neighborhood, because in Philadelphia, different immigrant groups, even if they were Catholics, they formed different church communities. And so we can see the same thing there, where we have to take account of different impulses affecting the history. In this case, ethnic and class-based differences, also reflecting, in the case of these riots, anxieties over immigration, which related to the influx of Irish immigration after the potato famine in the 1940s. And we can see that kind of Protestant Catholic sectarian conflict often targeting Irish populations in the United States and in other cities besides Philadelphia, like New York City, into as late as the 1920s. And another issue that came up as I was writing this book and dealing with this introduction were cases that involved disputes over religious freedom involving Native American groups. And one of the challenges there, and it's an ongoing challenge in the legal realm in the United States as well as in Canada, is how to account for Native American religions that value the sanctity of place and not practice or creed. So another element of religion, complicating our understanding of religion, what religion is the idea of religion as something rooted in sacred spaces. And so all of the things that I learned by writing this book helped me, and I think are continuing to help me, to think more critically about religion in my own country and in religion in the context of US history or the history of the city of Philadelphia. So I think all of these ideas are comparable. The other thing is rights of majorities, and also what is a majority anyway? For example, let me give you an example in the Ottoman case. I mean, we could think of Muslims as the majority, but the reality is Muslims are very heterogeneous. And there were Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims, and also Muslims representing different groups. And not all Muslims enjoyed power in the same way. And the state changed also dramatically, as states in the region changed dramatically in what they expected people to do or to be when they said they were Muslim. For example, in the 20th century, and after the period I stopped studying, countries in the Middle East became far more intrusive in the lives of Muslims about trying to regulate what Muslim children learned about what Islam was and what it meant to be Muslim. And they did that by controlling textbooks in public schools, which they required all children to attend. That's very different from the situation of Muslim practice in the 19th century or the 18th century or earlier, when Islamic states were not intruding into people's lives and telling parents what their children needed to learn.
Thank you very much. So I'm looking in the chat. Are there any? Oh, okay, there's a question.
Oh, I just put the name of the author, the French art historian who wrote the study of icons. That goes back to Helen's question, where he showed the sudden appearance of icons showing the Virgin Mary on horseback and saints like Saint George carrying weapons, and how this may have represented the beginnings of the assertion of Christian and Jewish ideas about parity. I mean, and another thing, by the way, bringing things up more towards the modern period, is with regard to the Armenians. One of the things in 1915 that, and actually from the 1890s onward, that two factors behind the story, and I go into this a little bit in the book, are one, on the one hand, the influx of new refugees, Muslim refugees from the Caucasus, like Circassian and Chechen groups, which exacerbated social relations and intensified anxiety. So you see refugee movements, wars, immigration as a process. And the other thing from the 1890s, Armenian groups, small numbers of them, trying to, as a result of their contacts with Russia, trying to get access to weapons. And I think a lot of history books don't actually, in narrating the history, explain why many Muslims might have found that so threatening and so socially disruptive in light of historical practice.
I think Helen wrote that she can't see the title.
Oh, I think I might have had to send it to everyone. Wait, I'll do that again.
Right.
And I can also, if anybody writes to me afterwards, I can send you the actual reference to the article, but it has a very long title, so I won't do that now.
Right.
I'm putting it in the chat. It's a long French title. There we go.
Okay. Right. So if there's any further question, it should be posed now because we are coming to the end of our time. There's no, just a thank you. Okay. Well, then let me thank you. I really hope that maybe in the near future we can actually bring you from Philadelphia to Frankfurt to have a real discussion with you. I mean, not that it was unreal, just we saw each other but nobody else. You didn't see anybody else. And I hope that can be changed in the near future. And you would love to continue that conversation. I think also with regard to the project that we're having in Frankfurt, you would be a wonderful dialogue partner. And for me,
well, I would love that chance too. And by the way, if anybody who attended today actually sees me in person, like if you see me at an airport or at an event, you have to come up and say hi, because I didn't get to see other people. So like you might recognize me and I might not recognize you. So then you have to come up and say hi.
Yeah, these are the difficulties of webinars. But thank you so very much. And usually I would also now invite you for dinner. We could continue our conversation, even that is impossible. So I hope for the future. And I thank you so much for accepting the invitation for a wonderful talk and for also complicating our notion of ambivalent neighborhoods. That's really important. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. So goodbye to everybody. Just an invitation for the next week. My colleague Iris Ilson-Schein from Beersheba is going to talk about a phenomenon that is also relevant for neighborhoods, namely questions of translation. That's more an intellectual history approach, where it is about the appropriation, the transformation of ideas by translating. So that's an element that we're going to discuss next week. Thank you to everybody and have a nice evening.